Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Sharon Florentine. Welcome to today's webinar, Removing Technical and Security Debt with DevFirst AppSec Tooling, brought to you by Neurolegion and WhiteSource. We have an awesome webinar for you today, as usual, but before we get started, I need to go through some housekeeping items with you. First, please remember that this event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of it, you'll be able to go back and watch it again. We will send you an email with instructions for accessing the webinar on demand, or come visit us at securityboulevard.com/webinars, and it will be there for you as well. We'll also have it at devops.com/webinars too. All right. Please remember you can submit questions at any time during the presentation. You can use the Q&A tab on your console there to send those in. Don't wait, don't hesitate. Send those questions to us. We will get to as many as we can at the end of the presentation. All right. So with that, I am pleased to introduce to you today Oliver Morodoff, VP at Neurolegion, and Susan St. Clair, the Director of Product at WhiteSource Software. I'm going to turn my camera and my microphone off, and I will let you take it away.
Right, thank you very much for that jovial introduction. To put it one way, I think let's start off with an introduction, not only in how to correctly pronounce our name, but also a bit about Neurolegion and indeed WhiteSource. So I suppose I'll kick off. Neurolegion focus on providing developer-focused DAS tools, so dynamic application security testing technology, to scan your web apps, your internal apps, and indeed your APIs, whether that's REST, SOAP, or indeed GraphQL, WebSocket protocols, and of course any corresponding APIs with your mobile applications. We're really about putting security testing into the hands of developers, being able to build that scan surface from your very first unit test, for example, to try and integrate security testing as early as possible, to try and automate as much of that process integrated into the CI/CD, but more importantly, to provide the developers with real results that they can trust by automatically removing false positives. Again, giving developers actionable results with remediation guidelines they can fix early, but also to try and discover more within that process by also automatically detecting a suite of different business logic vulnerability tests as well. And it's great to be here. Thank you for joining.
And with that, I don't know how I can even follow that. Hey, everyone. Very excited to be here. A little bit about WhiteSource. Ollie was talking about really empowering development teams to identify vulnerabilities at runtime and even prior, as we get a little bit more about their solution. Where WhiteSource is really focused is identifying and auto-remediating open source vulnerabilities really at scale. And we do that by supporting a large number of languages, package managers, automated integration into various pieces of development and DevSecOps workflows, and really, trying to facilitate the conversation between AppSec and DevOps and development teams by making sure expectations are clear through the use of automated policies. And we're very excited that it's not only us that's saying this, but Forrester as well. And we've been selected a leader for the second time in a row in the Forrester SCA Wave. So Ollie and I, we really see ourselves as complementary participants in the journey towards more secure applications.
Absolutely, it has been it's been great preparing this talk for everyone attending. So thank you very much for joining us. And yes, we are very much aligned on a number of different aspects when it comes down to application security testing. But perhaps we could look first of all at why AppSec is so important. Now, obviously, we don't need to sort of teach everyone to sort of suck eggs, as it were. But I think it's quite good just to sort of focus ourselves on the importance. If there are anyone there that perhaps isn't as aware on why they should be really focusing on security testing. And it was last year in the Forrester's report, The State of Application Security, that really picked out a number of key points and recommendations that organizations should focus on. Applications are the weakest link again, with a considerable proportion of attacks being carried out by exploiting software vulnerabilities or through indeed web applications. There has been a formidable rise in APIs. This has resulted in a shift and indeed a massive increase in the threat model and indeed the attack surface. And as we all know, with modern development methodologies, developers aren't stopping at all. And one thing that security needs to do is to keep up. And security mustn't stop either. And that's where they have this recommendation, and they talk about this shift left, shifting security testing as far left as possible so that security can match developer speed with integration ideally at all phases across the SDLC. Sorry, Susan.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add in. I mean, even though that this is in 2020, certainly, some of the surveys and some of the data coming out of even 2021, this is the same, right? Like nothing has changed. Web
Right.
apps are still risky. Software vulnerabilities are, where people are targeting APIs, insecure components. And even as much as those of us in the industry have heard about this shift left, it feels like forever and a day. Certainly that still is a priority of how do we get the right tooling to meet developers' needs as we ask them to do more as part of their release. Because as you mentioned, you can't stop. You still have to release those softwares and those updates. So how do we right fit and how do we match that up?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the key things that that was raised in this slide, and I'm glad that you picked up on it as well. And one aspect that in particular I like to also focus on is when talking about AppSec is really the importance of APIs as well. And I don't think you can talk about AppSec and not really talk about those, but I think in many cases it can be overlooked. And again, we're looking back in the past here, but as far back as 2018, Akamai detailed in a report that 83% of web traffic was made by API calls, which in a world of technology, that was a long time ago, as you quite rightly say, and we've been hearing about this for so long. And you'd always think, what would that be? That statistic be today? Well, luckily for us, we don't need to imagine. Gartner predicted, and I think it's even been surpassed, that 90% of all web-enabled applications will have more of an attack surface area in the form of exposed APIs rather than just sort of user interfaces. And that by 2022, which is literally around the corner, API abuses will become the most frequent attack vector. So, just to sort of drill home that point that, API testing really is a key aspect of that as well.
Yeah, and I think that's really being driven, I think, in two aspects. One, certainly the digital transformation that, again, for those of us in the industry, I'm probably tired of that phrase at this point, but it's really true, right? So you see these distributed architectures, these API first applications, which we all want. We need them to drive integrations and interoperability and the way that we work today. But that leads us to expose risk, as you mentioned. You could probably Google and find, your API breach of the day. It's become so prevalent. But also not only digital transformation, but business transformation as well. So, having actual initiatives like the open banking directive, which really was pushing not just like it's a good idea, but we really want you to do this. So I think a lot of things are really kind of going into this, Certainly API is everywhere, but even in a larger context, open source and software is just really everywhere. So even though we might have been talking about this for the last 10, 15 years, it's just become that much more critical and much more upfront, not of us in the industries, but certainly when we're talking to our product owners and our business owners and, even our larger community outside of work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, you mentioned the open banking directive, which, absolutely has catapulted and propelled, fintech and shortech, etc. But then you look at the IoT space as well, very, very heavily dependent upon APIs as well. But I think, one key question that I know that we like to ask is, when and how are organizations, carrying out their security testing in order to detect vulnerabilities, across their web applications, and also, more importantly, against their APIs as well. And I think in many cases, and it really depends on the size of organization you're talking to and where they are in their AppSec program, if indeed they have one. In many cases, it can be not at all, but in most cases, it's very, very late. And I know that, Susan's touched upon it, organizations are very much focused on the business needs that dictate new features, that, dictate revenue that perhaps is going to trump security. And they put more of an importance on ensuring that the application and API does what it needs to, and to do it quickly. And perhaps sometimes security testing can be that afterthought, as I mentioned. When you're looking at CI/CD processes, you've got this easy deployment of new microservices, a very agile way of working. Changes to your applications and indeed your APIs can be very quick, multiple times per day, very iterative. And the tooling needs the ability and, of course, the agility in order to test all of these assets. And I know that speaking to a number of different clients, whether they're startups or indeed larger organizations, there can be a very heavy and in some cases a complete reliance on manual testing. And this is slow, this is expensive, it's very, very time consuming, but also there's no sort of direct feedback loop that goes to developers, that now have to perhaps deal with periodic reactive fixes that actually leads to, and going to the name of this talk and the focus of today, is this accumulating technical debt. How can you chip away at that when you haven't got the automation that you need, and it's simply impossible to scale based on the fact that we said that security needs to keep up with development. For those that are listening, how many builds per day perhaps are you doing currently? How many applications do you have? How many APIs are there? How much are you spending on manual third-party testing, or indeed internal testing, to try and catch those medium to low-hanging fruits without automation as part of the pipeline? Because I know that some of the numbers that we hear are quite mind-boggling. And that's really drives the need for automation. Again, those iterations can be done multiple times per day. And you need the automation to be able to drive that up. Whereas security testing previously has actually been a bit of a barrier to that innovation and the business transformation that Susan was alluding to and talking about before, because it just creates so many human bottlenecks. And I think it's these human bottlenecks that are compounding this technical debt and or security debt, whichever seems to come first. I suppose, Susan, the sooner we can get that integrated into the pipeline, you're reducing your cyber exposure and being secure by design.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We do see such a wide range, right? We have like our more immature customers, just what do I even have, right? We're not even talking about security backlogs at this point. We just don't even know what we have. So really more of an inventory bill of materials kind of, mindset. And
Yeah.
then we have on the other end of the spectrum, kind of to what you were talking about, is just, I mean, they're integrated into hundreds or thousands of repos, and they are constantly scanning, and they've automated like everything from soup to nuts. But I mean, they still have these challenges of like, that's great, we can automate at scale, but what do we do with that, right?
Yeah.
How do we manage the backlog of those findings that we're now finding faster than ever? So certainly, I think it's a challenge. The tools in general, I think, have gotten much better across the
Mhm.
board, across the AST spectrum around detection. Now we have to do something with that backlog.
Yeah, very true. And I think with that backlog, I think some of it comes to the fact that, as I mentioned before, a lot of it's being done and carried out quite late. And there are a lot of benefits to automating that process, so that security bugs can actually be detected a lot earlier and fixed a lot earlier and treated perhaps as functional bugs, to make sure that the product does what it's supposed to do for the client base. But I think, just in case there are some number crunchers listening today, and there normally are, there's a very big business case to do that as well, because it's actually not only the most secure way of doing it, but also the cheapest time to do that too. And we can see here from a nice little graph, this is from NIST, you can see just how much more expensive detecting, or indeed more importantly, resolving any defects or indeed security issues in production can be. So really trying to detect that is definitely going to be the cheapest time. So you're not only going to be more secure, but also going to saving that little bit more budget for next year, perhaps. And yes, Caesar, I know that you're quite focused on the fact that it's also easier.
Yeah, I'm all about the efficiency. I'm all about, we have limited time, and we got to get our jobs done. So not only is it cheaper, but as you would expect, as a correlation, or as a factor to that being cheaper, it's also much easier to
Yeah,
find it earlier. And again, that makes sense. I mean, the further to the left or further to the right that it goes, things get. The harder it is to find and fix and roll back and find a window, a change window. I mean, it just gets harder. So the earlier that we can find a security bug, right,
yeah.
the easier it is and the less time to fix. So certainly fits very well with the cost presented earlier.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you use the word bug, because they should really be treated like, as I mentioned, a functional bug, in the application, not just seen as something very different as a security issue. But I think that alludes to the different ways, perhaps, that development and indeed security may look at or perceive or deal with or try to manage security bugs, security issues, or security vulnerabilities, that actually I think is needed to sort of bridge that gap, so that everyone's on the same, looking at it from the same way. And I think that, historically, there's been developers and then there's been security, and they've been these two siloed teams where everyone sort of talks about the throwing it over the fence. It's no longer my problem anymore. But I think historically they've looked at things very differently. So developers want to really make sure that speed is there. Perhaps think more on the functional side of things and general use cases, as opposed to focusing on security. They like to stay within their environments, and don't like a lot of noise. And for the security guys and gals out there, they assume that everything is broken. Let's put a block on that. We need to make sure everything's secure. We want to know all the edge cases. We want to have alerts firing off. We want to try and understand everything. We want to research and delve into things. But that goes against the CI/CD DevOps, DevSecOps mantra or methodologies that organizations are trying to move towards now, Susan.
Yeah, and I think it really comes down to, kind of the function of each of the groups in the organization, right?
Yeah.
Development teams are, they're trying to fix things, they're trying to develop things, they're really there to support the business, right?
Mhm.
And in maybe a competitive point of view, that side of the business, whereas security typically kind of goes up through maybe the risk chain, right? So they're trying to protect from risk exposure. So it kind of drives different mindsets. I mean, this is security's job is to protect, whereas developers is more like, but my job is to get this out here and create that business advantage.
Yeah.
So it really kind of this dissonance, right, in terms of what they're looking for and what their objectives are.
Yeah, but I think we're seeing we're seeing this shift, and you'll probably be hearing the word shift a lot in this talk, but also if you're listening to other talks around AppSec. But there needs to be this shift where actually everyone is going to be responsible for it, because yes, developers want to develop this new cool feature and then move on to the next thing, but there's nothing worse than when your security team are coming back to you 3 months later or a year later with a penetration testing report to say that, by the way, guys, you need to go back to what you were doing before, and you need to try and plug these gaps. And it's that's leading and driving this security and technical debt. And I think for the purpose of this webinar and the conversation, I don't think they should be looked at differently. They should be seen as one, with a view that actually everyone should be responsible for security testing, right from engineering right through to security, and working together for that. But it's also good, probably part to look at how developers and securities prioritize different aspects or requirements when considering their tooling. And I know, Susan, you guys recently looked at some statistics around this.
Yeah, we actually did a survey, right, where we reached out to security professionals, we reached out to development, DevOps, and said, hey, really what's important to you? When you're looking at an AppSec solution, what's really important to you? And what was interesting, I think, is that, kind of to your earlier point, now the rankings were different, right? So what's important to AppSec is maybe not quite so important to development teams. But in terms of like the features or the characteristics of what they were looking for, they were very similar. So, security might be looking for ease of integration and implementation because they're a small team, right? They have a lot to do. Or compatibility with the languages, right? That's always a challenge within AppSec. There's so many languages out there, like, making sure to support that. Well, developers care about that too. I mean, I don't want to use a tool that doesn't support my tech stack or it doesn't support the language that I'm developing with. So there really is this alignment. And because kind of what you were saying before, where everybody has a stake in AppSec, you know, AppSec teams are relying on development, not just because they're like, oh, it's your code, you go ahead and fix it, but it's also because they have to, right? They're small teams supporting very large populations. So, how do they, drive that adoption where everybody can work together and everybody's happy is important to both teams.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going back to what you said about compatibility with the tech stack. Just for anyone out there listening, just from a DAST perspective, that's not actually of a concern. But I think you're absolutely right. What I find really interesting about this this visual is that you have the priorities, with developer adoption being at point number 6. And although it appears actually that security and developers have very different priorities, they're actually very much aligned together, because you've got early adoption, you've got ease of integration and use, you've got coverage, for example, and scan performance. I think these are all actually circle back and geared towards developer-focused technologies, spearheading the adoption of security testing, so that organizations can actually start to shift this security testing left, so that they can, organizations can actually start to find these things a lot earlier. So, almost this linear thing again could be sort of, like the loop that we always see with CI/CD and stuff, because actually they're all intertwined together on the basis that actually your developers need to take ownership of security testing, or security need to enable developers to almost be the first line of defense to try and find these things a lot sooner, to fix them a lot sooner, or at the very least to be able to prioritize the remediation efforts earlier rather than later. Which brings us on. So for those that perhaps I appreciate people at different sort of maturity levels, perhaps in their DevOps pipelines. Some are just looking at security testing and trying to understand, where does SCA, where does DAST fit in, where am I going to invest my time from a security perspective? What do I need to try and achieve DevOps, DevSecOps, and indeed shift left? And one of the first things that I like to see when talking, with clients, when doing other talks and going to meetups, is buy-in. I think it needs to be, it needs to come from the top down, and met from the bottom up as well. And I think security culture is something that's really key. And I think one of the main priorities when you're looking at DevOps, DevSecOps, and some people don't like DevSecOps. I think it just concentrates the minds to focus on the security part of that. And with a security culture, this can be spearheaded by security champions, if indeed you haven't heard of that, where someone in the DevOps team, whether it's in the development side, security, or maybe somewhere in the middle from the QA team, can act as a sort of go-between between the two siloed organizations that we're obviously trying to bring together and start to marry. But I think first and foremost, that's one of the main things that organizations need to look at.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think security culture is huge. Huge, huge, huge. You cannot, or I shouldn't say difficult to prioritize security if the culture is not there.
Yeah.
Personal experiences I could give examples from, but if the prioritization is more around speed without security, it's going to be very hard to kind of put that in. But in addition to having the culture, you kind of have to, so that's kind of the foundation. Now you kind of need the tooling and the scaling to kind of sit on top of that. So I really kind of see these as both aspects to developer adoption. To develop delivering secure applications at scale. So again, you need to make sure that you have tooling that fits your development community, not only the languages and the package managers, again, focusing on the open source aspect of it, but certainly, your IDEs and your CI/CDs and, your the pieces that, really fit together to have that SDLC process. You need to make sure that you support that. You need to make sure that it makes sense, right? So you're not adding overhead to, a 5-minute pipeline now becomes like, an hour and a half. Like that's not going to work. So you really need to make sure that the tooling not only supports, again, your tech stack, your tools and your processes, but also, the culture, I would say more the soft things that go into deploying an application. All of these kind of have to match to make sure that you're actually going to start to see the results that you're hoping to get from deploying tooling like this.
Yeah. I think I know that, having been to, talking about it from a DAS perspective, having been to meetups face to face when, if I can remember what that was actually like 18 months or 2 years ago. But it's funny, I can have a room full of, developers and then, half the room is, penetration testing ones, even when I've been to other AppSec meetups. And, it's probably rare that you'd hear this from a DAST vendor, but, they all sort of chime in to say, they really find DAST quite hard to use historically. And I think that alludes to the developer first tooling. And you mentioned before that there has been, a lot of success, across the AST market in this developer first aspect, removing a lot of the pain points, as it were, which I suppose we'll get onto later. But also having that, automated in the pipeline. So you mentioned staying in your IDEs. The developers like to stay within their environment. They don't want to move away from that. Security, as we mentioned before, they like their, shiny, glossy UIs. They want to try and have a look at the, all the edge cases. You've then got, the CISO perhaps that wants to have an overarching view of their risk, etc. But ultimately being able to plug that into your pipeline, to find things earlier, again, like you mentioned, speed is a critical thing. But ultimately, it's about reducing, I think, reliance on. It says security here. I think we always have to rely on security, but I think it's reducing the reliance on the amount of resource that's needed for security to manage that process. If you have it all automated, and obviously reducing the reliance on manual testing, which I think is so important for that shift left. Okay, so what are then the sort of key features that you need to look at when considering your sort of dev first tooling in order for you to succeed? So Susan, I don't know if you want to start.
Oh, absolutely. So again, I feel a little bit like a broken record, but I think, number one, it has to be easy to use. And, I do dislike when people are like, oh, it's so easy, it's so da, 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 and totally completely remove the complexity. AppSec is a complex thing. But if you want to get adoption at scale, we need to look to see like, well, how hard is it to add it into your CI/CD pipelines, or how hard is it to integrate it into GitHub issues? These things need to be, for the most part, out of the box. You're not looking to spend, hours and hours or longer, just doing basic integrations. You want to get up, get going, and really focus on, maybe the more value add part of the remediation and reducing that backlog. So I think number one, it has to be easy to use. It has to be intuitive. And I would say just as part of that, that means that, again, you're within that workflow, you're within that work stream for your DevOps and your development teams.
Yeah, I think one aspect from a DAST perspective, and I mentioned it before, that the teams or the different sort of sides of the room sort of sung in chorus about how complicated things can be to use, how complicated they can be to configure. So I think the onus for developers to be security experts, it can't be there. So you mentioned the removal of complex configurations. I think there has been a lot of improvement there. Us as Neurolegion have really tried to focus on removing as much of the complicated configurations as possible, with smart scanning features, which I won't get onto, but it's all about just sort of point and click and scan. But I think the tools need to do a lot of the heavy lifting. So configuring or the configuration needs to be part of the pipeline by way of YAML configuration files, overseen by security, and less of the sort of hand holding that perhaps we've seen. And from our perspective, coverage is plays such a big important part in that. So when you're looking at the built or the compiled application, from a DAST perspective, you're really testing it as in its runtime state, as, let's say, a hacker would be looking at it, as your customer base would be interacting with it. So with microservices, single page applications. I know, Susan, you touched upon that before, APIs that we've already spoken to. Modern technologies and modern architectures, you require as much coverage as possible. So it's really something that's, I think, key to when you're assessing and picking your tooling, that it can deal, for example, with multiple different authentication mechanisms, hard to reach parts of the applications that also need to be tested early too, to try and reduce the amount of manual testing or testing further downstream that will just be another bottleneck that is then only going to compound some form of technical debt and or security debt, because perhaps you're not finding these things earlier as you should be with the sort of dev first tooling.
Yeah, yeah, no, that makes sense. I think that makes sense. Coverage is definitely, that's what everybody's looking for, right? In terms of, these types of solutions. I would say the other piece is definitely, your next bullet, which is speed. Can't slow down. Got to get this stuff out the door. So, certainly as part of, our solution at White Source, again, depending on which work stream we're going into, but, being able to look at for vulnerabilities and issue tickets, as part of a merge or as part of a commit, or proactively say, hey, that this particular thing is out of date, and lots of other people have tested it, so it's okay to upgrade. So not just in speed in terms of the process and the actual scanning, but certainly like how can we make the whole process more efficient. So
Yeah.
I know that you guys have done a lot of work on that side of the house as well.
Yeah, we're very, very aligned on that as two organizations. I mean, that really is something that's key. DAST historically multiple hours, days, in many cases, but it's really about the ability to run a very short, it says here, scope-defined test, which I think puts it perfectly, for every build, every commit, or maybe every merge. It really depends on where you are in that process. But speed really is key, because the last thing you want is for developers to start pushing back. You need that adoption that we spoke about, which is obviously something that they're very keen on. But running these short incremental tests that lasts for minutes, few minutes, not a few hours, as I mentioned, is gonna assist you in doing that. And I think that brings us actually quite nicely onto the security loop, actually. So yeah,
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I know this is something very passionate for me personally, is that, nothing exists in a vacuum. And, you hear a lot like shift left and dev zone security and, da, 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 and that's great. But really it is about a feedback loop. So, again, the security culture that we talked about earlier, what exactly is security important, first of all? So we're designing secure applications. So that's part of the feedback loop, clear expectations. Certainly making sure that, as, not only scanning, but also, remediation, where we can improve, where we're struggling, maybe we need some additional education. So making sure that the visibility is there between the various organizations, not just on the negative, because I think we tend to think about that, but we want to make sure that we identify, again, where can we improve? Do we need more training? Do we need better tooling? Do we need this? Do we need that? But really making sure that everybody's in on the loop in terms of expectations, as well as process improvement.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned one thing about the remediation, and I think with the speed, and that loop with the quick feedback, ideally on every build, that results in a sort of on-the-go remediation, and that actually will assist in driving down that technical debt or the security debt, because I think you can then start to prioritize and fix earlier. You'll be more secure. There's less risk. And it's these bite-size fixes that are going to be manageable and scalable with that security loop. I think developers actually, from experience with surveys that we've done, love the fact that it can be a very seamless automated process. No one intentionally introduces sort of security bugs. That they're picked up on these issues from a developer's perspective, and the engineering managers and leaders, and indeed the security, are able to understand where their security teams are going wrong, in more of a real-time basis, then actually you can get that on-the-go security awareness, or maybe some, introduce some best coding practices, actually, so that you can start to prevent the same issues being introduced further downstream, without having to wait again, perhaps for some delayed reporting. And this really alludes to, we speak with startups that have no security team whatsoever, smaller team that want to produce secure product, don't know where to start, and actually can pick up, in our instance, a DAS tool and get going. But even larger organizations that perhaps haven't got that well-oiled machine as much as they'd like, but value the fact that they can see where their issues are as early as possible. But that, I think, brings us on also to accuracy of tooling, because I think having a tool that is easy to use, that we mentioned, that is integrated, it's got the feedback loop, etc., is great. But one of the biggest pain points from our perspective, from a DAS perspective, is the number of false alerts, the number of false positives. If organizations are having builds failing because of these, for example, if the developers have constantly got a ping from their Jira with issues coming up that needs manually validating, they're soon going to make their feelings felt. And actually, it's something that's not really scalable. One thing from a Neurolegion perspective is we're very much obsessed, as it were, about trying to remove the noise, and also to give the security time to focus on perhaps some more impactful concerns. So from our perspective, the results need to be accurate, they need to be actionable, with developer-friendly remediation guidelines, so that you can actually start to fix these early. Because it's this manual validation of issues that I mentioned before is very slow, it's expensive, and it is only going to slow you down. I think this is one of the main contributors to technical, or to security debt, certainly. If there's any CISOs listening now, how are you able to effectively evaluate your risk when the results may be skewed with false positives, or with issues that you need to have manually validated, that is going to drain your one security person, for your 50 developers, for example? It's very, very hard to try and validate that risk. Don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I mean, again, I've been in the industry a little bit, and probably the number one thing that comes up repeatedly, regardless of vendor or technology, is false positives, or accuracy.
Yeah.
So certainly I think, and we can talk about automation, I can automate this and I can automate that, but garbage in is garbage out. And it really destroys the trust between security and app dev. So I think like having highly accurate, highly actionable results is huge, huge.
Yeah.
Even in addition to that is, even if we have great results and they're spot on, like how do we prioritize them? So again, in my world, in the open source world, that library might be have a security or a CVE associated with it, but am I actually using that little bit that's risky? Well, that's a way to prioritize. So, is it reachable? Is it in the execution path? I think you can also look at prioritization in terms of, like we talked about, API exposure, and, really understanding like the business environment that your application fits in. So, prioritizing is this particular part of the library or the API or what have you, transmitting PII, or is this a public facing application? So I think being able to, again, this kind of goes back to making sure everybody's on the same page, but having highly accurate results, and then clear understanding of how we prioritize that to that most effectively reduce that backlog.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very much accuracy, which is why we focus so much on giving developers real results. Perhaps not all the edge cases that security are looking for, but certainly removing the noise so that developers can actually start to trust it, and then ultimately they can then also decide on the prioritization. One of the examples I always like to give, I heard it somewhere before as well. If you have a credit card and you're constantly spending $500 a month, but only paying off $200 a month, after a year you're going to be in trouble. So getting accurate results so that developers can actually trust the output with developer-friendly remediation advice will enable the organization to then start prioritizing as well from a DAST perspective. And like you've alluded to, is my application using this dependency, so that you can actually start to prioritize, I think, a great points. Just conscious of time, because I did see a few questions in the Q&A. Best practices, Suze, I don't know if you want to kick off that, so that, for high performing organizations, as we put it.
Sure. So again, we took a look at, what are high performing, and a high performing organization, just so we're all talking the same language, is really, ones that seem to have a better handle on things, right? So they're automated. They are, they don't have huge security backlogs. Their mean time to remediation is fairly low. So, what are they doing right that we can learn from them? And you'll notice that actually, I would say the first four items on this list is really about that security culture, in my opinion. So again, making sure that there's an active dialogue and active feedback loop between AppSec and AppDev. And again, that AppSec champion or that security champion is something that we see, right, fairly often. It sounds like you guys see that for pretty often too over at Neurolegion.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's a good way to facilitate, because certainly we don't expect everybody to be an AppDev or in AppDev to be a security expert, but some expertise is still sometimes needed. So making sure that, you have that dialogue in place, making sure that, again, there is a consistent application of a formal and structured secure or SSLDC, secure SDLC. We'll just do it that. Again, you can't have like one team doing this and another team doing that. I mean, certainly there's different approaches, but it has to be consistent. Again, support your teams with education on an ongoing as well as on-demand basis. There's a lot of great platforms out there, and make it a priority. Again, when we're developing something new, one of these new distributed applications with, API first, let's make sure security is front and center as part of those non-functional requirements in the same way that functional, and the same way that performance, usability, all that good stuff. And then, of course, number 5, I feel like we've probably covered this one a lot in this whole
just a bit.
a little bit. It's, again, you need to make sure that the tooling fits the developer workflows and the developer work processes, not just, again, from a language point of view, but the code repos and the CI/CDs and the IDEs and the ticketing and, all that good stuff that goes into deploying a secure or a part of developing and deploying an application.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the 5 points that we have on this deck, very much are aligned between Susan with White Source and also Neurolegion from a DAST perspective. Whereas previously DAST has sort of historically been built for security professionals that didn't perhaps address the culture aspect so that developers can be drawn into the process to put it into them, the consistency perhaps with the issues with false positives, getting that pushback. These are all things that sort of Neurolegion have looked to address as well from a DAST DAST perspective. And I just saw, so one of the questions in the Q&A was, building that security culture. How can you do that if developers are so reticent to it? I think that sort of drives forward the fact that perhaps the tooling hasn't been appropriate for you to successfully try and integrate that into your pipelines, and that's why it really is such a key focus for that. And we mentioned a high priority. We put in there, engineering to own budget. Maybe that's something that I know that we're seeing a lot of. That actually now we've got all parties coming to the table. But one thing just to sort of finish off, because we want to leave sort of 5-10 minutes for the Q&A, is SCA and DAST. Can you achieve good coverage? Where does that leave you from a security posture perspective? Susan, I don't know if you want to start and I can finish off.
Sure. So again, I always look at security as truly this multi-layered approach. So in terms of kind of like how SCA and DAS, how that really supports the creation of secure applications. Again, an SCA approach is going to look at, again, very early in the life cycle. So part of your code repositories, part of the actual building, even potentially like which ones you choose or not, right? And then kind of carries over into kind of the building and the CI/CD aspect of it. Actually really nicely as part of a DAST or a Neurolegion, where that kind of picks up and where they kind of overlap.
Yeah, and I think one thing I don't know if you can see my mouse actually, but one thing that we like to sort of focus on is the fact that being a newer technology when you compare us to other DAS providers on the market, we are built from the ground up to, of course, be trusted by security, but ultimately to be loved by developers, to sort of coin a bit of a strapline. But that's really is our sort of focus. So building the attack surface as early as possible. So, can you leverage your unit tests to start building the attack surface to start testing early? Can UE be used by the QA? Again, not perhaps being security experts, but can they take on our technology to start perhaps integrating security testing as part of their functional testing? Can they leverage their functional scripts and upload those into our engine so that actually you can integrate accurate, comprehensive DAST scanning with good coverage? And obviously, if any of you here want to try and understand a bit more, then you can sort of feel free to reach out to Susan and I. Just conscious of time now, or indeed, I think this deck will be shared with those attending. So if you have any questions, I'm always reachable. Here are some of my details, and indeed Susan's. But thank you very much for attending, and we can perhaps move over to a Q&A. But thanks, Susan. It was a really nice chat.
Yeah, no, likewise. And the Q&A is always the best part. Anyway.
Right. Okay. Hi, Sharon.
Hello.
Hi there.
Hello. That was awesome. Thank you both so much. And I'm going to jump right in because I know we've got a bunch. I will say first that if we don't get to your question right now, please don't worry. We're going to send all of these over to Ollie and Susan, and they will be able to follow up with you offline. So
absolutely,
in time, they will get to your question. Right now, we're going to start with this one. With development and security both playing a part, where are you seeing the budgets for security coming from?
Okay, I'll take that if you don't mind, Susan.
Sure.
I think accountability for AppSec from our perspective has moved. Whereas it used to sort of be a decision for the CISO. I think I touched upon it a little bit in the talk. It's now more of a core component that maybe engineering managers are accountable for security testing too. If you're developing a a retail banking app and it gets hacked, where does that blame lie? Does it lie solely with the CISO, or perhaps now we're engineering leaders now looking to advocate proper security practices in their pipelines? And I think security management and software development actually needs to be run in parallel. Integrating security early, as obviously we've sort of shoved down your neck during this talk, it saves a lot of time. I think developers like those security facts and not sort of hyperbole, and automation, is key. So I think that shifts it left, as we've been saying. And I think the ownership of that budget, going to the question, it can't just be the CISO that's responsible. I think that accountability has moved, and the management of the PLL for security testing should go, with engineering as well. I don't think, and Susan mentioned this before, I don't think it's just to have a security backlog and then a backlog for features. I think that just needs to be a backlog. And we're seeing now, whenever we have conversations with organizations that are looking to either introduce DAST or are experiencing a lot of pain points with their DAST that they want to try and remove, we're seeing those budgets coming from maybe the CTO office. A lot of organizations don't have a CISO or a security team, but actually now want to integrate security testing into their pipelines, or the ability to run security tests without having a security team. So that's what they're coming to us for as well. So I think it depends on the organization. I think, to answer the question in a shorter way, I think it comes from security. I think it comes from the DevOps and the development team as well, in many instances now, as a sort of shared responsibility. I don't know what you're seeing, Susan, or perhaps if you've just seeing we're short of time, I don't know if you want to move on to other questions.
Yeah, I would just say very, very briefly, I would agree with that. I would say the main buyer seems to be still more AppSec, but certainly app dev and application teams are taking more ownership of this, both from adoption as well as from a P&L point of view.
Yeah, thank you. All right. So let's see. Integrating security testing is easier said than done, especially when asking our developers to own this. What's being done about this, and what successes have you seen?
I guess it's my turn. I'll
Yeah, go
start
for
and
it.
then I'll pass it over to Ollie
Go for
as per our practice.
it.
Um, Not to minimize it, it is probably the hardest thing in AppSec, again, regardless of tooling, is to get dev teams to actually use it. There's always something, right, that doesn't quite fit. So outside of the tooling and doing the very best that you can to support, again, their tools, their processes, their languages, all things in their world that they live in, I think it's probably two pieces. Certainly, I think having clear expectations. I think, again, being in the AppSec industry, it's always like, oh, you have a high severity thing. I'm gonna shut that pipeline down. I'm gonna fail it right now. Maybe not the best way to start. So being, I think, empathetic to their needs is certainly a big part of it. Creating clear, realistic objectives, especially if you're just starting out for teams. And then I do think that AppSec champion is huge, because they can kind of see both sides and they can be the mediator, if you will, between the two teams. I think there was something else in the chat or in the Q&A that said that person is really hard to find. 100% agree. What I've seen in organizations that have been successful with this is identifying people within and within those dev teams and training them up and promoting them to be that person rather than trying to hire from without. Ollie?
No, I completely agree with what you said about finding that person within. They know the organization, they know the teams. If perhaps they're not security focused, give them the training. Get them to sit in with the security team if they've got one. Listen to them, learn from them, give them a bit of training, let them be that go-between, because actually security sometimes doesn't speak the developer's language, and developers certainly don't speak the security language. So that's the champion within the organization. If you can find someone within, actually, it was funny because I did a talk about 6 months ago, and actually got some feedback from one of the people listening, saying, actually, we did an analysis and I was the perfect fit to be a security champion. So it's actually great to see it from that perspective. But just as a few last points to that, I think you're right. It's very hard to integrate it, but I think historically, I think it boils down to talking about tooling from a security perspective. The tools don't fit and they don't work properly. Again, there's too much noise. There's too much configuration that developers can't be expected to use. They're not the experts.
Sorry, I've got to cut you off. We're at 1 minute before the end. So I just need to wrap up. This has been recorded. We'll send you an email with instructions for accessing it on demand, and we will also send you the slides as a handout. Our Amazon gift card winners today are Calvin H., Vincent A., Alan D., and Deborah W. We want to thank all of you for joining. Again, we'll send your questions over to Ollie and Susan and get those all answered. Thank you so much. I am Sharon Florentine signing off.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.